Alright, section 4, just the letter left. Dear Louise Glick, I've just finished reading your collected works from 1962 through 2014. As part of my poetry graduate class, I was only required to read 5 volumes. However, I found I could not skip any of them. I knew I was creating more work for myself, and yet I simply couldn't resist. I will confess here that I am primarily a fiction writer, and that I had not yet had the pleasure of reading your work. After I read Firstborn and The House on Marshland, I knew I needed to pause to discover more about you before I read further. As I began to delve into your interviews, I was transfixed. I saw parts of my own life mirrored back at me. You said I was not a successful adolescent, and then went on to describe how you were withdrawn and lonely, then anorexic, and pulled out of high school. I too always felt separate from other children, as if I always wore a mask disguising my true self. I also developed anorexia, and I missed a significant portion of my senior year of high school. Your poem, Dedication to Hunger, startled me as if I were walking down the street and saw a stranger with my own face. I remember lying in bed at night, touching the soft, digressive breasts, touching, at 15, the interfering flesh that I would sacrifice until the limbs were free of blossom and subterfuge. I felt what I feel now aligning these words. It is the same need to perfect, of which death is the mere byproduct. You capture in precise, beautiful language the struggle of both the anorexic and the artist to reach perfection, that demanding, unattainable place where the flesh is unencumbered, as the poem is also unencumbered by excess, by flab. I see that striving in your work. Each poem is stripped down to its bones. In interviews, you describe your obsession with perfection as a frenzied unhappiness attached to the idea of perfection. You describe a constant, intense anxiety regarding not just writing, but everything in uncountable forms. Specifically, you talked about how when you're writing well, you are terrified you won't be able to finish what you've started. When you finish a book, you're afraid you'll have to pay for it somehow. And then you worry that you will never again be able to write to that level that you've just achieved. While many artists and writers would recognize these feelings, for you the anxiety seems to reach the level of a torment. You describe your concern that you seem to fetishize a propensity for suffering and say of yourself, I suppose I have a vocation for mourning. I recognize elements of myself in your words. I have not and most likely will never reach your level of success and accomplishment, but even with very little published in my name, I'm still nearly paralyzed with anxiety each time I sit in front of that blinking screen. I wonder if that frenzied unhappiness attached to this need for perfection stems from that long ago struggle with anorexia, or if it is an innate flaw that preceded even this. I think you would probably say that it doesn't really matter. This quote of yours sums up my own reason for writing. Writing is a kind of revenge against circumstance, too. Bad luck, loss, pain. If you make something out of it, then you're no longer been bested by these events. This is how writing kept me alive when I was slitting my wrists at 15. I shudder now to admit it, how cliché, and yet it is what happened to me. Each poem, each story, each handwritten page was a rung on a ladder for me to grab onto, leading me that much further from the bottom of the pit. I've kept a few of the poems. They were terrible, but they served their purpose for me. Your poetry served its purpose for you, but your poems also were released into the world and were able to touch and inspire others. Here is the purpose, then, to make something beautiful out of the pain. This is how art holds restorative powers for both the artist and the reader. I loved your description of how absorption in art allows for an intermission from the self in the midst of suffering. You describe the artist as cultivating a disciplined refusal for self-deception, since the only possible advantage of suffering is that it may afford insight. I see in your work that you have successfully scavenged your pain to create poems that are a revenge on loss. but they are not just meditations on trauma, which you correctly state does not itself make art. You have gazed unflinching at your own darkness, and wrestled from it the meaning and insight and brutal beauty that makes a poem a work of art. I respect you immensely for that, and I very much want to do the same. In my poetry, I think I'm still in that stage where the loss and the pain can be depicted on the page, but that something is still missing from it. In your essay on sincerity in Proofs and Theories, you argue that the artist's task involves the transformation of the actual to the true. This is a difficult task indeed. Where I am frustrated is in this transformation, the alchemy of facts and events and that elusive something, which is truth, to create a finished thing, which is art. In the end, even in the midst of your suffering and anxiety, you battled your demons and continued to write your truth. These truths are sometimes shocking, often uncomfortable, and seldom provide any easy answers. But there is a need for this poetry in the world. In closing, I love your description of the poem's power to rescue the reader. Poetry is important because, by giving form to devastation, the poem rescues the reader from a darkness without shape or gravity. It is an island in a free fall. It becomes his companion in grief, his rescuer, a proof that suffering can be made somehow to yield meaning. I want to thank you for the contribution of your poetry. As a reader, I feel your poetry is both a companion in grief and a rescuer. As a writer, I'm inspired to create art that yields meaning. If I keep this goal always in my mind as I write, I think I will be okay. Sincerely, Kyla Steinkrug.